All right, so I'm here joined today by Dr. Natalie Duvall. Hello, Dr. Duvall.
Hello?
Hello. So Natalie, um, although she has questionable taste in men, is a longtime high school English teacher. I think we decided it was 19 years or maybe 20 years,
Maybe 18, I don't know.
maybe 18. It's been a few years anyway, as well as having her doctorate from Johns Hopkins University. And so I thought it would be good to talk to you because this week, what we're talking about in class is the overall idea about theories of learning and teaching, how those connect. And so, sort of like both the theoretical approach and the practical approach, which obviously, with your experiences, I think you have some insight into both of those lenses. So,
Yeah.
anything else? Yes. Um, Anything else that we should say or that you would like to add about your background before we launch into our talk here?
I would just add actually that I spent several years running an MEd program for in-service teachers. So I can also see that lens of not just me as a teacher in the classroom, but other in-service educators in various school districts and settings, because no school system is the same, really.
Yeah, true. All right. Yeah, I mean, there's sort of like a high level view where you can say education is this, but it breaks down pretty quickly when you zoom in, I think.
Yeah,
All right. So
not all I have to say.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so for this week, we don't have, we just have basically a couple of excerpts from, some books, but the one quote that stood out to me from this Onion reading, A, because it's a little bit tough to digest what they're saying, but B, I think it sort of gets at some questions that might be interesting, is it says, we derive our notion of theory as an architecture of ideas, a coherent structure of interrelated concepts, whose contemplation and application, one, help us to understand and explain discursive and social phenomena, and two, provides a model of the way that discourse and social systems work and can be worked upon. So, I feel like there's a lot there to unpack, but also I think what they're trying to make the point that theory is different than things like journalism, and that it should be more explanatory about what's going on. But I also think, obviously in this class we are going to talk about a lot of different theories about learning and connected theories about teaching. And I think sometimes uh, we feel, maybe the general public feels, like there is a way, like a defined way that people learn, and that therefore there's a defined way people should teach. And I'm not sure that that's accurate, but I thought, yeah, I would get your thoughts about it.
Well, and I think we've talked about this before, but I was watching that. I shared we were both watching, and it's nothing new to us. But like the theory of gravity, right? Like when you think about the theory of gravity, the amount of gravity on any object on Earth is the same, right? But because of wind resistance or air resistance, right, nothing falls the same. And I think maybe some people who are like, there is a theory of learning, think that it's like gravity, that there's the same force exerted, right, on every student. And so maybe one kid has wind resistance on them and doesn't fall at the same rate. But I don't think, it's not gravity. The human brain isn't gravity. We're not just feathers and bowling balls, right, dropping in the air. I think about it when, if you think about the average US classroom, right, has 20 to 30 students in it, and think about all the differences within those students. If one has ADHD, if one has an SLD, if one has a history of trauma, if one has parents going through divorce, if one is from think about even all the different cultures that are in the classroom and those things. So you have all these different things and sometimes in combination. And then you have the teacher's a variable too. So even if you're thinking about the education is like gravity, well, education's not the same in general because, right, isn't a classroom with no windows inherently going to present a different learning structure environment for a classroom with windows and things like that. So to say that for all students, one theory of learning could actually be set up to give the same results is almost mind blowing to me. And I know you and I have talked about this before that teachers should have something to frame it. Just like I think when the Mr. Dr. Duvall, right, is running, you have a framework, a theory behind how you train, and it works for you. Is it the best theory for how to improve your running? That's up in the air, right? But does it work for, I follow that one ultra marathoner, and he has a completely different, like he will punish his body, right? And I'll be like, oh, don't do that. But I've blabbed a lot. So what questions do you have on that?
No, yeah. I think that's all good things to point out. My theories about running are basically that I hate it, is one of the main theories, but also I find it rewarding. But yeah, there's definitely different approaches. And it's interesting, like one of the things I think that we might be touching on a little bit for sure in this class, maybe not in our discussion, but is this idea of expertise. And so how do you know, like we're gonna look at four major theories of learning at least, all by really smart expert people who have a reason why they believe these things. But the same thing with running, for instance, like my running expert that I rely on is a guy named Hal Higdon, who was a runner and helped Nike design some of their early running shoes, but also is not necessarily like the best credentialed runner. Like he won some stuff, but is not like, for instance, I don't know, Usain Bolt or something who has all these world records and things, right? But has devoted his whole life to running. And so there's something to be said there. But also I follow Hal on social media, and sometimes he'll post stuff about training, and people go like, "You're completely wrong. That'll never work," right? So, and they might be right. Like it might not work for them or for a certain set of people. So, I think that is part of what we need to keep in mind. At the same time, like the one thing about all of these theories is there should be some sort of empirical way to test it. And that doesn't necessarily mean a laboratory experiment, but it does mean some sort of observable data that you could replicate. And I think, one of the challenges to education is that it's very hard to scale something up and make something completely generalizable without having it be, I think a lot about design guidelines. And so there are certain probably design guidelines or instructional frameworks that are going to have better success overall. But I don't know that there's, you can say you should do exactly this series of things in this sequence, and it'll always result in effective learning for every student in your class. And I think sometimes that's where we get hung up in education. So it's a weird thing. I mean, on the one hand, there must be something we can learn about education and learning, or else why are people here in my class? Why am I here talking
Oh,
about it?
yeah.
Yeah, so there's definitely some things we can learn, right? But it's also, I think one of the things you learn is that there's no singular thing that you can do every time to achieve perfect results with every student.
Because, and I mean, too, I think it's almost even as if maybe what we can learn is what is detrimental, right? When you think about, I mean, my general theory of learning is that everyone can learn, everyone, right? And I think, you can, no matter which theory of learning you look at, they're showing people can learn, right? Um, And so maybe looking at maybe trying to find the detrimental things, right? Because when we think about like hitting children, right? There's been enough research now, right, that says that this can lead to anxiety and other negative outcomes in the future, more behavioral problems, things like that. So corporal punishment, maybe I should say, right? So that is, it's valuable that that was taken out of the school systems. Um, but when you were talking about like what can be improved in things, you and I were just watching I don't know, an exploration of what was it, the 100-meter dash.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and that's good thinking of Usain Bolt, thinking of that, right? 100 years ago versus now, when really, when you have all these new improvements, right? Like better tracks, better footwear, better starting systems, better training, better nutrition, you're really only talking about, mere seconds, right? So I don't know what that means and why I brought it up, but right,
Well,
if
yeah, I think there's
everybody
this,
learn.
right. Yeah, I think there's this idea that we could make exponential gains in learning by implementing the right thing. And it's the same thing in that there's a certain human element that goes into it. So, the effect size, a lot of educational research is concerned about effect size because the effect size of certain changes, even if they're magnitudes of changes, if they don't affect a large group of people, then is it worth trying to change the way a lot of people teach?
Often, you and I often talk about that. Neither of us really supports BF Skinner,
Right.
right? But we do sometimes use it for an effect in our children, in our own
That's
children, right?
right. Right, exactly. That's a good point. So sometimes there are useful things in theories, even if theories of learning, even if that theory of learning isn't fully explanatory of every aspect of learning and isn't necessarily one that you completely agree with. There was a paper I read at Drexel that's considered a foundational paper in instructional design by Peggy Ertmer and something newbie, Ertmer and newbie, and they talk about how instructional designers should actually be aware of all the learning theories and think about what the learning objective is, and then use that to guide which theory they use. So they shouldn't get tied into like this is one learning theory. I don't know if I would go that far because I feel like I tried that and it didn't work out well for me because I have a clear theory about how people learn, and it's hard sometimes to go against, to feel like you're going against like what you believe. But yeah, for sure, there you can incorporate elements of your different theories to great effect. I also think the one thing that gets left out of this theoretical discussion is the fact of like systems and policies that are in place that make it almost impossible to adhere to your specific learning theory totally, when you're in a situation. So I think that's some of the tension between like academia and practice is that as a researcher I can decide what I want to research and I can come in and just do that for a year and collect my data, and then I go home and I go, yeah, this works, everybody should do this. But the teachers often don't have the power to do that. And even things we know, no matter what your theory of learning. So, like you and I have talked about this before too. One of the things we know about education in the United States is that it's better if kids start high school later in the day. And yet, no school will do that because it messes up sports, it messes up all these other systems. And
And that's
so, you know,
decades of supported research, right?
right. And
Yeah.
so, this idea that, well, if we can just prove it scientifically, then everybody will adopt it. Even that doesn't hold true because that's one of those things, as you said, for decades, people have known this, have shown it over and over again. That, if you start school, even just a matter of like an hour later, it's tremendous gains in learning as education measures it. And yet nobody will do it. Like it's slowly, school by school, it's sort of coming in, but I don't foresee that it will ever the sort of status quo. So,
Even the schools that are adopting it aren't adopting it based on what the research says. I feel like they're moving to like 15 minutes or something.
right,
Um, but even so, that's a great like example too to segue into like what people call common core math.
right,
Because even though it's gotten into, it had the government pushing the policy behind it, by and far, wouldn't you think that communities hate it? Even though, we call it common core math, but what it really is a push from, now I'm blanking on the terms just because I'm going to think of it, a blank from procedural knowledge, right, to conceptual knowledge. And that's what it is.
right.
And for you and me, when we work with like our kids, sometimes we're like, right, because they have all these different ways to attack it, but it really is better, right? It really is better for students to learn conceptually why math works that way rather than just the procedure of getting there. And it just is better. But it's such a shift from what the last generation learned that even though it's better, it's different.
Hmm.
And different isn't acceptable. So I think, and you can go ahead, you know what I mean? You can go and say, well, the theory of this is it's not really called common core math, but that's based in constructivism, isn't it? Am
Yeah,
I
I
making that up?
yeah,
Um, and you could go and explain that theory of learning to Mr. and Mrs. Smith, right? But that's not that's not gonna affect their views on it because they know how to make change at the grocery store, right? And so they think that they learned best.
right. Yeah, there's this idea, I think that um like people are being a little too precious or a little too fussy, like about teaching math. Like, why can't they just learn it the way I did with my gazintas? I think I have a gazintas reference in every one of my um,
You're
interviews so far, so I'm gonna leave it in. But and then yeah, and I think the other side of that is that sometimes the teachers who are teaching in that way have not been had that theory explained to them or do not support that theory of learning, and so they end up, as we know, sometimes our kids have teachers who are really buy into it and you can tell they're doing this kind of stuff, and sometimes we have teachers who are like, well, we have to do this, so here's a worksheet that shows you 5 different ways to you know add things, but the point isn't to conceptually understand how to add things, it's to fill out the worksheet, right? Which is not the underlying goal of that shift in mathematics instruction, but is what some teachers take away from it.
That's a good point, actually, because I could name the teachers right that I think got into it, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good discussion. I appreciate your time, and any closing thoughts you wanted to share with the students as we embark on our semester?
Um, if you get a bad grade, tell Dr. Duvall his theory of learning is different than yours.
Very good. All right. Thanks for the time.